First, on behalf of ARPAS UK members, Kevin, Callum and Mark, we'd like to thank you very much for being here in person at our annual conference, kindly hosted by Cranfield. I have to say that at ARPAS UK, we believe that the regulator is an industry enabler, and we are keen to work with you to drive industry growth. So maybe a few words of introduction for the benefit of the audience. We set up a regulation special industry group, back in January to collect the feedback from our members and subject matter experts on different topics. There was also discussions we held with Rupert, our regulation director, because that feedback forms a basis for a first preliminary paper that we shared with the CAA, forming, let's say, our top priorities that we would like to cover for 2023. So thank you again, the CAA RPAS team for being here with us today. Now I'll let you the floor. The CAA RPAS Unit team will first share their presentation and insights, and then afterwards we'll open the session to a Q&A session.
Thank you, Annalise, and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Kev Woolsey. I'm the co-head of the GA and RPAS Unit, and first and foremost, I'd like to extend my thanks to Graham and his team for giving us the opportunity to come here today at what seems to be a fantastic facility and to speak to you on behalf of the CAA. We've prepared a few slides which we'll take you through, and as Annalise has explained, after that we'll be happy to take any particular questions that you've got. What we've tried to do, thanks again to Annalise, has provided us with a list of top questions, if you will. So we've attempted to begin to answer those for you this afternoon. So with a bit of luck, there won't be too many questions at the end. And if you do ask me any, please be gentle. But hopefully this will be of some use. So and of course, I'm joined by two colleagues from the team, Mark and Callum, who are managers who work within the team in the RPAS side of the unit. So I think without any further ado, we'll crack on with the presentation. If I could ask for the first slides to come up, I'm going to glance away towards it because I've got a memory like a sieve and I need to be prompted about what I'm going to be speaking about next. So there we are. We'll all get a speaking part in this. So we'll rotate through the podium. Could I ask if you've got any particular questions that you hold them to the end? There will be an opportunity, like I said, to ask those questions that we don't cover whilst we speak. So next slide, please. Okay, let's talk a little bit about communication. I think because we're stood here today, we're starting to hopefully generate the impression that we've got an intention to do better in terms of communication. And we want to be more effective as the regulator communicating with the regulated community. And the way that we see the best way of doing that is to employ events such as this. Entities and associations such as ARPAS, I believe, are key to this undertaking because I can only be in one place at one time. If I have a message, it's far more efficient use of my time to use associations to pass that out many times, as opposed to me obviously trying to do it one-to-one with everybody who's got an operational authorization. So looking through these bullet points here, I recognize that we can do a better job than what we have been up until now. I can only promise you what it is that we'll do in the future, but hopefully you're beginning to believe me by the fact that I'm stood here with you today. We've already begun to reinvigorate our engagements with the RAEs. Please don't think it'll be limited to just the RAEs. As I've said, I include ARPAS in that undertaking as well. We know that you, as a regulated community, were fans of the consultation that we did last year. So there will be more of that. They don't necessarily always have to be fully public consultations. And we may talk a little bit later on about PDRA 01, for example. And when consultations are required, they may be tailored to appropriate groups in order to manage the tension between the time available, we want to be getting on with things, and then the appropriate level of consultation size. Lastly then, more efficient utilization of multiple engagement methods. So here we are today, but we don't have the monopoly on good ideas. So we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. So I'd like to listen twice as much as I do talk. And with that in mind, we have an open, an open dialogue with the likes of yourselves for better ways of communication. Okay, next slide, please. One thing I'd just like to point out, and this is part of a wider undertaking that was kind of a consequence of the exit from EASA, was you've obviously noticed that we published the AMC guidance material at the end of December. We'll talk to you more often, I think, perhaps next time we do something like that before we drop it. The AMC guidance material, I believe, is a step in the right direction. You may not agree with me right at this precise moment, but I hope that you will come to. CAP 722 got viewed by many as being the regulation, and really the point I want to underline here is that it isn't. So there's a bit of a diagram. Apologies, a little bit of an eye test for those of you that are in the room at Cranfield. But I just wanted to summarise the way that the regulation is organised. You can see on the top left of the diagram, you've got the basic regulation and then the Civil Aviation Act on the top right. And the way that then cascades down the screen is through secondary legislation in terms of the implemented and delegated regs. And then there's the AMC and guidance material. So the primary and secondary legislation, so the two layers on the top, are law. So that really is where your focus should be in terms of regulatory compliance. AMC guidance material and, crucially, the CAPs are not law. So as we move forward, the AMC and guidance material that you will see published are in some ways an evolution of what was in CAP 722. 722 will get smaller as the AMC gets bigger, is the kind of the general trend. The important takeaway for this audience, for everybody really, is that the regulation is key. That is what you need to be compliant with. So anything that increases your understanding of that is a good thing, which is why I think the AMC and guidance material is a good thing, because the way it's written, it's very easy to see which article of regulation it's about. CAP 722, as much as we may have loved it in the past, is not necessarily quite as good at that, I would argue. For those of you wondering what 785, I think it's 7852004, that's the insurance regulation. The last point I'll make on this slide is notice how the Civil Aviation Act cascades through the Air Navigation Order. The basic regulation cascades down through the UAS regulations, as I've mentioned. What's important is that if you have operational authorizations within which there are certain conditions attached, it's worth bearing in mind that there are articles within the Air Navigation Order that still apply. Let's say Article 241, which is the one to do with reckless use of an aircraft. In the same way as it is legal in terms of the law to drive at 70 miles an hour on a motorway, I think we would probably all agree that that's not always the safest thing to do. So what's worth bearing in mind, if you can follow me on this analogy, is that it may well be within the conditions of your authorization to do a certain thing, but when examined through the eyes of a court following an accident, for example, where someone has been hurt, they may look towards something like Article 241 in the Air Navigation Order and say, but was that a sensible thing to do? Just in the same way as a judge would look, for example, at driving at 70 miles an hour on a motorway in freezing fog. So I think point made on that one. I hope that was useful. I think that may be my last slide for now. So we'll have a break in voice, but we'll see who's next. I think that's going to be Mark. Mark is the Oversight Manager. I'll let him introduce himself, and he can take you through the next part of our presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Kev, and afternoon, everybody. Sorry for keeping you waiting earlier. Sean, can I have the slides up, please? Right, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are more directly customer-facing, some of the things that you'll encounter much more in industry. As Kev said, I'm the Safety and Oversight Manager within the unit. So I've got the overall remit on Kev's behalf to look after everything that affects public safety, affects safety and perception of the various areas that we cover, and all the oversight activity. So that includes all the applications that are sent into us for both general aviation activity, general aviation airworthiness, and everything connected with UAS and ARPAS. So whether you've been visited by some of the inspectorates, you've had oversight conducted, or you're simply applying for various use cases, it will all flow through one of the teams that I sit and look after here. So the first thing we're going to touch on a bit is the newly published CAP 722H and PDRA 01 contained within. And in a few slides' time, I will be talking more about PDRAs and what the concept of them is, and a little bit on what our plans are there. We're about to issue some new amendments to 722 Hotel, and really point 1 and point 3 sort of link in together on that point there. 722 Hotel is part of an attempt by us to make sure that we demystify as much as possible our background processes and the way that we intend to make sure that things in the industry are done safely. The concept of a predefined risk assessment is that we follow the same risk assessment methodology that anybody would do if they're submitting a full operating safety case, but we've done it for you. So we've looked at what the risks are inherent in the type of operation we're looking to authorize via this predefined risk assessment. We establish what mitigations are going to make it reasonably safe as reasonably practicable, and then we apply those requirements to yourselves. So in the simplest form, PDRA 01 says that as long as you use the correct type of aircraft, you stick within the mass category that's required, and you're the holder of a GVC qualification, then those mitigations make the type of activity that it permits as safe as we think is practical to do. There are issues within PDRA 1 right now connected with the overflight of uninvolved persons. As we evolve our risk assessment methodology, as we look to a new methodology that we'll speak about in a few slides' time and that Callum will refer to a little bit more, we keep things like this under constant review and constant assessment. So there are undoubtedly things that we will discover as we go along that may require a degree of change or maybe something that we look to review. It's important that I say right now that PDRA 01 as it exists today has not changed, but it's part of our remit to make sure that everything we authorize, we keep under a degree of constant review and assessment. If we do any reviews that will meaningfully affect any of our operational authorization holders, anybody flying in a specific category, we'd like to do that with a degree of nuance and common sense. We certainly would not look to withdraw a risk assessment methodology entirely without being able to replace it immediately with something else. While our primary aim is safety, we all work in the Safety and Airspace Regulation group within the CAA, and safety is rightly the first word in that group's name. We also have the remit to enable industry to do what it needs to do as much as we possibly can. So we do bear that in mind whenever we come to these kind of things. There has been some messaging recently through 722 Hotel and about PDRA 01 that has probably not been as coherent or as useful to you as the industry members as it could be. So we do recognize, as Kev said in his introduction there, that our ability to communicate with you and our ability to make clear what it is we're trying to do has been quite compromised. So a lot of the challenges that we're seeing connected with PDRA 01 and its general use could have been avoided if we more robustly and intelligently engaged with you as stakeholders. So I want to re-emphasize that again, that that's part of why we're here. We're here to make sure that we're able to do that more effectively, both now and in the future. So we are looking at what can follow on from PDRA 01 as well. PDRA 01 served a good purpose in terms of mimicking the requirements of our old permissions for aerial work and permissions for commercial operations back from sort of 2014-15 onwards. There will be, especially as we move to the SORA methodology to carry out our risk assessments, different things that we can identify. They can go up to BV loss operations absolutely fine. It's one of the holy grails of the industry in that sense, but there's no reason why mass use cases that large elements of the industry want to achieve cannot be downloaded to a predefined risk assessment. We'll look at any use case that could possibly be of benefit to you. So we've already had suggestions, for example, that PDRA 01 might work more effectively if it was split into different aircraft categories. We've also had a suggestion from an industry stakeholder that thought that the use of fixed-wing aircraft to carry out mapping activity should be separated from industrial inspection with a multi-rotor. So again, if we can look at different predefined risk assessments, where the mitigations will be different in some way, and it will enable us to do more things, then we really are all ears in that sense there. And I think that's a message that you will get throughout what we're saying today, and hopefully throughout the questions and answers later. We need industry input on this kind of thing. I could easily look at other international uses of PDRAs, look at EASA's approach, look at JARPAS's approach, but what we need to know here is what does the UK UAS industry want in terms of PDRAs that simplify things from your perspective and give you access to more operations. Now, they are all subject to continuous review and the potential for amendments, but hopefully what I've said there shows you that nothing will be randomly withdrawn. We've got no intent to suddenly pull the rug out from under elements of the industry. If we make changes, it will be done in an intelligent way, subject to review, and hopefully with something that can immediately supplant it or replace it in that sort of way there. Now, there are other PDRAs out there. I've mentioned JARAS, I've mentioned the EASA ones. The frameworks and the way they've been created are not compatible with what we're doing in the UK at this time. There are some fundamental differences. Our approach to SORA, when it's fully developed, will be different from the EASA one and will differ slightly, at least from the JARAS one as well. So while these do exist out there, we're not going to mimic them, we're not going to copy them straight across. But the concepts that they have and the type of operations that they enable are certainly things that we'd be interested in. So that's the background on PDRAs. Now, one of the other main ways that you'll contact people within one of my teams is when you're in the process of making an application. And one of the common things that we get questions on is application processing times and engagement with the inspectorate who are actually assessing what you've applied to do here. One important thing I should mention here is that there's a key difference between predefined risk assessment applications and applications that are backed by an operating safety case. Because a predefined risk assessment already has that risk assessment element done, it's a very quantitative check. What we're looking for here is that you've got proof of the mitigations that we've identified, that you have a valid GVC, that you have produced a valid ops manual with the correct information in it, and that you're using the correct types of aircraft. So because of that, the PDRA bulk processing is done by our shared services centre. They're effectively like the front desk of the CAA. It's the same entity that would process an application for a private pilot's license or an application to become a flying school or something along those lines. It's only in certain circumstances that a query related to a PDRA application will be escalated to our ARPAS sector team, who handle all of the operating safety cases. So there can be some potential for confusion or mixed messaging there, I understand. We often get contact from applicants who think that we're the ones responsible for everything that's happening with your PDRA applications. Often we're not. If it's a standard PDRA with no complexity issues, it's going through a different department, and our responsibility is to provide external oversight of that activity and the general safety view across the industry. Now, if you submit a safety case-based application, it first goes to the Shared Services Centre, who will do a bit of a quantitative check again to make sure the right information is contained. That's why you may get a sort of automatic email back saying you've not provided proof of insurance or you're missing certain qualification certificates that you mentioned in the application form. Once it's been completed there, these cases then get passed wholesale to the ARPAS sector team. What these guys are doing is they are then conducting a full risk assessment. So they are looking at your risk assessment you've done and assessing exactly how you built these risks up, exactly how you have agreed on the mitigations that make your risks as safe as practicable, and then assessing those to see if they're robust enough. Robust is a term you'll hear an awful lot in the regulation and in feedback from the ARPAS sector team when you're applying as well. A robust mitigation against a safety risk is basically one that works as well as you say it will. It really does lower the likelihood of a risk to the extent you've stated, and it's one that works every time, or close to every time. So you can be sure it works well, and it is going to work every single time you're out there operating. And that fundamentally is what the team are looking at. They can go into an awful lot of detail depending on the complexity of your operation. What we're assessing here is the whole reason for the specific category of operations existing. Callum will speak in a little bit, I think, about the certified category and what we're looking at in terms of the 3-category layout in the future. The specific category is named so because we can apply specific limitations or abilities to you through an operational authorization. It allows us to authorize almost anything and things that are not captured by other more solid bits of regulation, like the future certified category regs when they come out. So it will always require an in-depth risk assessment and an assessment of unusual new technologies, different forms of pilot competence evidence, or different things that you want to achieve in the end as the end result. Now, we do recognize that this can be a frustrating process at times. It is not a fast process at this stage here. We are looking at a new assessment methodology being brought in terms of SORA, which will not necessarily turn into an immediate time saving either. It may take us time to adapt to that as an industry, not just as a regulator. We have an opportunity to make better use of technology, and we are currently exploring how we might digitize an awful lot more of this application process. to make sure that it is not purely person-centered and it is not just a pile of PDFs being looked at by an individual person. So there are definitely ways we can speed that up, but that is not a quick process to enable. What we are doing in the meantime to improve processing times is embarking on some very, very thorough continuous improvement in both our team's appreciation of the regulation and what they must check to make sure that they are not going too far off piste and commenting on your font size and your spacing between words and things like that. And we're also undergoing yet more recruitment. So we've expanded the ARPAS sector team by pretty much 100% since I first joined the CAA a couple of years ago. And we're looking at increasing it in size quite considerably again. You'll see in a couple of slides' time, it's a relatively small team right now, and the throughput of applications and information they get is absolutely enormous. Hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're doing right now in terms of how we assess your applications and what we're doing with regard to PDRAs and how your safety case application flows through us. What I haven't touched on very much is the external oversight factor. One thing we're doing to, again, try to improve things for you as the industry is extend our ability to carry out risk-based oversight. What we want to be able to do is look at industry use cases, identify which ones need more understanding from us and more assessment of your safety ability, and we will get out there with our inspectorate and see what you're actually doing on site. We will watch you flying, we will look at what you're doing at your HQ, and we will make sure that everything is as you've said it's going to be. As we get expanded to that form of oversight, it gives us much more information on the safety basis that the industry is based on, which will allow us to start looking at things like extending our operational authorizations for longer. It will allow us to look at what areas are fit for lighter touch assessment and lighter touch oversight, and which areas we should really be focusing on. So rather than 100% focus on every single application that comes our way, this is the way that we're going to enable things to be smoother for the industry as a whole.
Good afternoon. I appreciate everybody in these types of events like to sort of read into some of the words that are spoken and out on the sort of presentation. I'm not saying you should. One thing you might want to read into is, I joined the CAA 13 months ago and I could still grow a full head of hair back then. So that's something to read into perhaps. First slide, please. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about tomorrow and some of the exciting things we're doing to enable the future. What I will premise that with is, I appreciate there's frustration sometimes when we continually talk about tomorrow. Well, tomorrow is always tomorrow. When is it going to come? Today. What we're discussing now is, it is a look to the future, but it's what we can do today. So I don't want you to think that this is a 5, 10, 15 year ambition. What I've tried to do is just cover off some of the key questions that we've already received from ARPAS, which I believe were collected from its members, in order to hopefully provide as much time after these couple of short slides for your audience questions. So hopefully it doesn't feel too rushed. We've talked about flight worthiness, and we've brought the topic up in our key stakeholders forum, I believe about 6 months or so ago. There's a little bit of confusion of what flight worthiness is and what it isn't. It's specifically for the specific category only. It's not about certification of RPAS. So when we talk about certified operations, we're talking about airworthiness. When we're talking about providing a more robust mechanism for operators to, convince the regulator that their platform is suitably robust and meets a certain set of standards, that's when we're talking about flight worthiness. Not every aircraft in the specific category is going to have to meet flight worthiness standards. So, Mark alluded to this. The challenge, perhaps equally an opportunity with a specific category, is just how wide a scope of operations it can encompass. So when we begin talking about more advanced operations beyond visual line of sight, perhaps overpopulated environments in non-segregated airspace, I know all those words get everybody excited. We are going to have to be able to demonstrate a level of flight worthiness with your platform. And what that means is manufacturing standards, but post-manufacture, it's not good enough of something to have a rubber stamp on it as it comes out of the production facility. We've got to put mechanisms in place to ensure that, 12 months down the line, 2 years down the line, whatever it might be, that we can continually assure ourselves, both as organizations and the regulator, that those sort of manufacturing standards are maintained. So that's that. Air competency. So, it's no surprise. We have one recognised pilot competency for the specific category, the General Visual Line of Sight Certificate. And we appreciate, as I did during my time in industry, it's perhaps a challenge to convince the regulator during the application process that your pilots are suitably qualified to conduct more advanced operations. And quite often today, that's done in, previous military experience, other courses that haven't perhaps been accredited through the CAA, previous traditional flying experience. We are working on advanced pilot competencies beyond the General Visual Line of Sight Certificate. Our intention there is that we start to see these fall into place by 2024. Initially, it's going to focus on beyond visual line of sight operations. So what you'll have is a recognized competency, much like the GVC, for beyond visual line of sight operations. Certain beyond visual line of sight operations, clearly there's a delineation between BV loss in segregated versus unsegregated, for example. We do intend to expand that into more courses, not just BV loss. We are working with select industry partners on this concept now. And as we get slightly more advanced in this, then we'll bring sort of that coordination and collaboration piece into a wider demographic. I did mention at the start that, I appreciate 2024 might seem far away. It doesn't for me. My firstborn is due in 8 weeks and I'm terrified. So 2024 doesn't feel too far away at all. One of the things we're looking at enabling now is operations within an atypical environment. I'm sure this isn't news to most in this room. You might ask, why is it called an atypical air environment? Well, that's because that's what it begun to get called within JARPAS many moons ago. So we've adopted the same piece of terminology. What it is a recognition that there are certain volumes of airspace, not classifications, certain volumes of airspace that due to their sort of characteristics, you're less likely to encounter other conventional aviation. For example, the airspace in the immediate vicinity around a power line or a railway or perhaps a road. And that we know the fundamental challenge for enabling beyond visual line of sight operations in non-segregated airspace is how we sufficiently reduce the mid-air collision risk. Now, non-segregated, outside of an atypical air environment, clearly there's a discussion there around detecting the void, but within an atypical air environment, something like a railway, where due to the proximity of that piece of infrastructure, we're unlikely to encounter conventional aviation, can that be used as a mitigation to prevent the mid-air collision risk? And then, therefore, begin to enable BV loss operations perhaps sooner rather than later outside of TDAs. Next slide, please. It's absolutely horrible looking at yourself on a 100-inch screen. SORA. I'll touch on this quickly. I appreciate we might get some nuanced questions around this, so I don't want to take up your question time. This is an opportunity. It is not a risk. I was an operator for many years. There is a genuine opportunity within SORA to more simply articulate to the CAA when you're submitting an application how you've identified and mitigated risk. The argument could be made that there's a degree of subjectivity of how we do that today. And I think that would be a fair assessment. This removes that subjectivity. So, I guess my plea would be, see this as an opportunity, not a risk to your operations. What we will see as well moving forward are predefined risk assessments based in SORA. So this isn't a case of, my goodness, I'm going to have to learn the entire end-to-end SORA process. In the future, if you intend to make use of predefined risk assessment only, clearly it's important you understand the background of it and what was done, but they will be based in SORA as well. Certified category. So this is kind of my baby, as it were. This is my primary area of responsibility. I mentioned that the specific category, one of its opportunities and equally challenges is just how wide a breadth of operation you can contain within it. When we begin to talk about carrying things like dangerous goods that perhaps pose a high risk to uninvolved third parties and passenger carrying remotely piloted aircraft, that will have to be done in the certified category. Now, that is full-blown what you think it probably means. The same levels of safety that we associate to commercial air transport will be in the certified category. That's full-blown flight crew licensing. So whereas in the specific category we talk about competence, in the certified category we talk about flight crew licensing. Operators that intend to operate in the certified category will be for all intents and purposes, AOC holders, which is the likes of British Airways or Virgin, and there's a strong degree of oversight there, and all the medical stuff that comes with that too. The aircraft will be airworthy. So this is where I said the delineation between flight worthiness and airworthiness. The aircraft flown in the certified category will have airworthiness types of certifications. Where are we with that now? It's still primarily focusing around ICAO. Lots of work in Montreal. ICAO distribute annexes, SARPs, that tell commercial aviation how to do particular things. They are now being all amended to reflect the opportunity to bring ARPAS into that. And our guide and vision within ICAO, and I sit in one of the ARPAS panel working groups within ICAO on this, is we have a picture of a commercial air transport aircraft, and that's what we're aiming towards. So your 737s remotely piloted, carrying dangerous cargo. Clearly, that is a future ambition, and I'm not suggesting for a second that we're going to see that anytime soon. But it's right and proper. We're working towards that now. Closure of dangerous goods. So perhaps some clarification here. That there are challenges with processing times around the carriage of dangerous goods. There are provisions to carry dangerous goods at certain times within the specific category. We are sort of getting our sort of feet under the table with how that looks like in a scaled way. So when we are receiving more than a handful of applications to carry dangerous goods, be that through delivery or spraying, that's another one, how we handle that. There is very well thought out a thorough legislation for the carriage of dangerous goods that transcends just aviation for everything. In terms of proportionality for the specific category, what we are likely to do is actually apply the legal conditions that we'd place on an air cargo operator, rather than putting you under the air navigation order dangerous goods legislation. Just make the applicable pieces of the law that we want you to comply with part of your operational authorization. And that might just sound awfully sort of boring. I apologize if it does. What it means is for yourselves in practical terms, you're going to receive simpler. It's going to be simpler to apply to carry dangerous goods in the specific category, and hopefully as time moves on, a bit faster as well in terms of application processing.
Back to me again. I get to bookend presentations. It's a perk of the job. Well, I hope that was of use so far, and thanks to Callum and Mark for their words. With luck, we've started to address perhaps some of the questions and specific questions that you may have had. Just in terms of rounding up, then we've got some answers to some of the questions that kind of remain on the screen right now. And what I think I'd probably want to focus on is, you can read the ones that are on the screen right now, and I'm just going to focus on the last one, which is to do with the size of the ARPAS unit. Now, Mark kindly gave you a bit of an inside view of how big the ARPAS unit is, and I think it's worth an explanatory note on that. The GA and ARPAS unit, of which I'm one of the co-heads, is about 65 people strong, give or take. So there's a couple of people that aren't mentioned in the numbers that are on the screen. Callum's one, I'm another. But generally speaking, what you're dealing with is a group which is about 25 people strong. So somewhere like about a third of the strength of the GA and ARPAS unit is actually ARPAS unit. And they will be responsible for conducting the types of work that Callum and Mark have been explaining to you. So assessing applications, conducting oversight, answering FOIs, dealing with other inquiries as well. And the simple fact of the matter is that any time spent away from assessing applications or conducting routine oversight is time I would try and minimize. And with that in mind, as has been mentioned, there is already undertakings to expand the size of the team, which is one way of addressing the challenge that we face. And the other is to try and introduce technology in order to increase the speed of applications processing, for example, by the digitization of the application process, of which the SORA is a integral part. The other part of it, and I'll finish kind of how I started, is about communication. making the best use of the people that you've got available to help out. So at the start, I offered up an apology for how we could have done things better, but also undertook to try and do better in the future. So we're here today, and part of it, as you'll probably realise, is that any relationship with an association or an RAE or any group that represents a slice of the regulated community, say the modelling associations as well, I'd include those, is I will be thinking, what can they do for me? As much as what I can think about what I can do for them. So I think it's a two-way street, and that's why I think it's really encouraging to see the kind of conversation starting that Graham has begun kindly as your chair to say, look, Kev, what can we do to help you as well? We can see that there are challenges ahead. What can ARPAS do? I think by happenstance, one of the previous speakers was talking about the challenges of dealing with local authorities. And, we've got some advice on those kind of subjects, because we've noticed that local authorities are potentially at times overreaching what they may actually be legally empowered to do. So what that means is that the ARPAS, if they can provide us with data on the number of incidents and occasions whereby they have trouble with local authorities, we can begin to equip you with the right sort of questions to take to those circumstances. What power, what law is the local authority relying on in order to make the kind of requirements to yourselves as operators? The CAA's board, one of the priorities is the integration of new users into aviation, and clearly the RPAS sector, which is by definition one of the largest, if not the largest aviation sector that we currently have. If you look at the number of pilots and aircraft, it is already 80% bigger than the commercial air transport and GA aviation sectors added up. Clearly, there are different types of aircraft, so I don't want to claim any false equivalence, but you kind of get my point. The scalability that we are going to need in the future to deal with the numbers of applications in such a vast sector are pretty clear. We can't out-recruit this. We need technology to help as well. The ARPAS, other associations, REs have all got a role. I'm equally interested in what you can do for me, as I'm sure that you're interested in what I can do for you. I think it is a mutually beneficial arrangement if we maximise it. And I certainly, at this stage of the game, would probably like to open the floor to any particular questions that you might have. And thanks again to my team for the words that they've had before. And thank you for the opportunity to speak up until now. Hopefully you'll be kind to me in this next phase.
Firstly, thanks, but I don't want to have any applause yet because we've got some questions, so we've still got a few bits to go. But if I could just summarise, guys, what I heard you saying is, hey, look, we know that we perhaps didn't do everything in the past as well as we could. We're happy to try and work with the community, and in particular the regulated community. We need information, for instance, on things like the local authorities. Would that extend as well to charges for FRZ fly through? I don't know whether anybody's had that sort of issue. There's a few nodding heads.
We build on that really, Prestige. We already have an online portal. If you have a complaint about access FRZ, you can go into. Perhaps we haven't done the best job with publicising. But if you type CAA FRZ, I'm sure come up, there is an online portal that you can submit for complaints and say any issues.
And I think, guys, the plea will be, though, the proof of the pudding is in the action. And I think that's where we'll need to keep talking over the coming months to say, hey, where are we with this one? Where are we with that? And try to drive things forwards.
I wonder if you've been given a difficult, or if not an impossible task. I wonder what is the benchmark you're trying to achieve. If I told you that I wanted to take 1,000 platforms tomorrow into regulated space, driven by unregulated pilots without insurance, by the way, and all the larger craft have to avoid the smaller craft, and that's the rule to follow, you'd think I'd taken a special sandwich from over there and not the one that everyone else had had. Well, that happens in my high street every single evening when the bikes come out and when the kids are going backwards and forwards, and that's allowed. And there's even an acceptance that a few people are going to die, right? Because people are dying on the high street, but somehow that's acceptable. The question is, what's your benchmark? You can't come out and say, no one's ever going to die in a UAV accident, because patently that's absurd. I'm wondering whether the problem is not your good selves, which I'm sure you know sometimes the industry feels it is, but whether some of that is within the industry. Should we be turning to our politicians instead of saying, politicians, stop avoiding all these issues? What you've done is you've handed it to the CAA and said, it's not my responsibility. If anything else goes wrong, it's certainly not me. It's the CAA. It's someone's career decision. Should we come at this in a completely different way and find a way of either using data? And my first question is, are you gathering data on each and every accident and mistake on every type of unmanned vehicle? Because if not, again, how do you manage that data? How can you prove you've made the right decisions? And with all those issues, how do we move forward faster?
Well, thank you very much for the question. It was a big one. And I think I'll start it probably from something that I've mentioned before, which is mentioning the government. I think that perhaps what you're starting to focus on is, what is it that the government actually wants? And I share your sentiments on that at times. We work closely with the DFT, who of course are the ultimate arbiters of what the regulation says. And we have frequent conversations about, well, what is it that you would like to happen in the UK? How should we approach this? Because simplistically speaking, once it gets to the stage where people like Mark are involved, assessing applications, there are two tasks: assess it for regulatory compliance and assess the safety argument. But I take your point about, the scooters and what have you as an analogy. And I must admit, speaking personally, I have noticed that the risk appetite for ARPAS is sometimes a bit lower around the bazaars than what is perhaps what the data is saying, if you like. We're not an all-seeing eye. So when it comes to the accidents, Aaron, I'll refer you back to the number of people involved once again. We don't know everything all at once without wishing to sound like a recent film. But I think that if I may meet you halfway on the question, is I agree with the what is it you want, Minister, aspect to it, because once it turns into regulation, our task is pretty straightforward. We can advise the government what we think their regulation should say, and we help with the rule-making tasks that do it. I mean, that's basically what Callum is all about in terms of the certified category. And we try and let, as much as we can, common sense and the use cases prevail. I'm not giving you a full answer. I totally appreciate that. But at least I can hope to meet you to say, I recognize what you're saying. We need to get the risk appetite right. And that's also why that we've spoken with the DFT and others to explore how do we review the regulatory set most efficiently to make sure that we're achieving the aims of what the government and the CAA board are setting for us. Because we can't be seen, we can't be seen as a CAA to throttle what the industry are capable of doing. I take that as an implied task as to what it is that we should be doing as a regulator.
So, my question regarding 722 Hotel, current understanding it's under review. We'll be in the process of renewing our permissions shortly. When do we expect 722 Hotel to be ready?
I think that the immediate corrections that we undertook to correct after the AMC Dynas material publication dropped just before Christmas, we've sent out in the last few days. And we will be looking to review 722 Hotel for the wider update. I'm not too sure on the exact sort of timescale on that at the moment. It's just...
With some select industry partners of being REs for an assessment.
Yeah, and that's right. That's currently being reassessed as part of the collaboration piece, getting feedback from that. So our intent with COTAN is to get it published as soon as you're using practically. I envision, and that's something very early that comes back in the next few days.
Yeah, okay.
It's in terms of our renewal now.
Should we follow the guidance in the current 722 hotel?
I'm still not quite sure how to phrase this. My question's running in my head. It's to do with the conflict, I think, between the innovation element, we hear from Gordon and we hear it all the time, and then the bureaucratic element, where we feel like we're told, oh yeah, we want to achieve this, and you try and achieve it, and they're constantly fighting. I mean, honestly, I'm knackered at fighting bureaucracy the whole time. I'm currently writing an OSC for probably what is one of the easiest flights I've ever conducted, albeit with a big aircraft. And it's coming towards 200 and something pages for like a 2-minute flight. And it's just ridiculous. And then at the smaller end of the industry, it just feels like similar to what the chap here said, the perception of risk is so far out from what the reality is. And I've been in this a long time now, and I'm tired of it. All right. So do you feel that in terms of that kind of growth duty element, that the bureaucratic element has been realistically addressed by the CAA and the people that you have to kind of report back to, as it were?
Do you mean, I'm just going to ask you a question back just to clarify what you mean. Do you mean that when you say the bureaucratic element, are you talking about risk appetite?
Partly about risk appetite.
I tried rephrasing. You and I have talked about some of this, which is it's the size of the data being requested at the different ends of the scale. Is that one of the things? Only that.
Okay.
Why, when you look at some of the new stuff, and I know some of this voluntary, and we talked about it in the REE meeting the other week, why are operators being required to re-input information that is readily available in the public domain and can be held in a single place rather than re-inputted by loads of people? It's a complete waste of time. So there's that element. But yeah, that the risk appetite in terms of some of this stuff is so low risk, really is. And PDI-1 is too big now, in my opinion. Again, it's far too big. But yeah, it's just a whole load of questions.
That you're talking about in terms of the material that's available in the public domain. Are you talking about technical details of the platform? Is that what you mean, that sort of thing? Yeah, okay. Right. So there's a couple of things on this then. So when it comes to the uniformity of information requirement that perhaps is part of that bureaucracy, if I can use your phrase, I think that the SORA-based application service should help to drive that down to the minimum requirements, what is required. So I think that might be some good news. Part of the two benefits of the SORA, simplistically speaking, are uniformity. So you get a more uniform assessment of an application that is not individually based, but is a system-based assessment. So I think that will help. And the other one is the objectivity side of things from the SORA as well. There is another aspect which has just gone out of my head on the bureaucracy, which I think, where I just want to say where we're constrained by the regulation. I understand your point and frustration about having to put in material that is freely available, but as regulators, regulatory compliance is what we're all about, and I think I'm right in saying that the regulation requires we need to know what the technical details are of an operation if we're going to assess it for regulatory compliance and safety risk. But I can probably look towards my colleagues here to build anything on that one. Callum can come in on with a little bit more on this.
Yeah, I think it's a really pertinent question. I think the question around risk acceptance and sort of tolerability, the CAA clearly has an approach to risk identification, mitigation. I think, Gordon talked about this a little bit earlier, and this has always kind of been the top of my head from when I ran a commercial drone company for 4 years. Our challenges aren't always necessarily regulatory ones in terms of application processing with the CAA in terms of risk management. There's kind of perception of societal risk as well, right? We all know friends and family and, society more broadly. And that's not to say that the CAA necessarily take that into account. We are very safety focused. But when we're talking about risk acceptance, it's for us as a community, it's not just down to the actual safety risk. There seems to be this societal risk acceptance. What will society accept? Society accept that about 17,000 people a year in the UK die from flu. That's accepted by society. Clearly, that's not accepted for drones by society. And that's not to say that we apply what society accepts into the way that we sort of process and evaluate risk from our side, from a safety point of view. But I think it is an important point to sort of bring up. The other point as well, and it's an experience personally to myself, is when I was in industry, I felt a particular way and held particular views. And it struck me, it's not until you hold the actual pen and you're the final arbiter of whether or not this thing goes out the door that suddenly lots of other considerations play into your mind. It's very easy when you don't hold the pen to say that something might be safe or you consider it safe. When it does, for Mark, for example, as the Oversight and Safety Manager, when it's his signature on something, it doesn't come back to the person that was complaining that it could be done safely. It comes back to Mark, whose signature's on the piece of paper. And I think that's also an important reflection as well. That's the only bit I've got to add to that.
John Martin here from Animal Dynamics. Got a question in regard to the changes on CAP 772. So firstly, really excited about the PDRA and the extension and the ability to maybe include BB loss operations. I think that's a really good step in the right direction. In terms of the changes on CAP 722, when a company or an operator has invested time and effort into complying with the regulation as it was prior to the change, is there then a waiver or an extension to the OA to allow them to then incorporate the new changes that are required under the new regulation? In our particular case, our OA is about to expire, and now with the changes to CAP 722, we now have to incorporate all the extra information, of course. And that takes time and it takes effort. And the second part of that question is, bearing in mind that there are changes ahead, then if we have already invested, or operators and manufacturers have already invested a level of time and investment into the process of how they've achieved the safety assessment. So, for example, functional FMEA as opposed to functional hazard analysis. Are the CAA willing to accept accept the analysis as it is, even if we haven't done the FHA method? So 2 parts of that question. Is that clear?
I might need to ask a little bit more about the second half of it. But for the first half, with regard to CAP 72, I really welcome this particular point, because one of the reasons that we put one of the earlier slides up with the diagram of the regulatory framework was to illustrate that CAP 722 is not the regulation. So simplistically, it was a forerunner of AMC and guidance material. So my point to take away from that statement is that the regulation hasn't changed. So therefore, what you need to comply with hasn't changed. So therefore, your application doesn't necessarily need to change either. Now, I can't obviously comment on individual applications, and there may be other things that you want to change anyway as a consequence. Now, for the second point, can you just restate your second part of your question, and then we'll...
The way we have conducted our analysis previously was not stated in the CAP. Now we're saying that, for safety analysis, it needs to be functional hazard analysis, as opposed to what we've done, which is functional FMEA. So the work we've invested, are we now under the new CAP, which you've just said is not it's not a legal requirement? The safety analysis we've already done, can we still submit that, or are the CAA saying that we do need to do functional safety analysis, which is something completely different?
Okay, so I think what you're talking about is CAP 72 Alpha, right? Yeah, okay. So this is to do with the compliance with Article 11 of the UAS IR, conduct of the case. A lot of what we've been talking about, and your question is another aspect of that, is about making sure that when your operating safety case makes contact with an inspector who has to assess it for regulatory compliance and has to assess it for is it safe enough to authorize? You need to be making their lives as easy as possible. So strictly speaking, I think I'm right, and obviously my colleagues here will jump in if I go off. If you're compliant with the regulation and you express it in a way which is perhaps not to our liking, an acceptable means of compliance and guidance material, CAP 722 Alpha is a version of that kind of undertaking. If you choose to do it a different way, then you're probably not making the inspector's job easier by doing it. So it's a little bit of a catch-22. I completely recognize the point that we may be asking you within the update to 722 Alpha to do something a little bit differently and to present the information in a way which we consider as perhaps a fuller and better way of complying with the regulation. But as the regulator, we would say that. And whilst we acknowledge the point of it feels a bit inconvenient from your end, I acknowledge that also. As we move towards the SORA and the digitization of ARPAS applications as fully as possible, and we generate even better guidance for AMC and guidance material to Article 11 of the IR, unfortunately, this is perhaps a slight fact of life that we'll just have to deal with. So I hope I've answered that enough, which is continue the old way if you want, but it'll probably slow things down.
Hi, Kev. David Walters. Great to see Callum and Mark out and about with you. It's certainly going to be welcomed by industry, obviously, with COVID and trade shows and things being limited. It's obviously been difficult for you guys to get out, so it's really great, first of all, to see that. The question I have is around growth. So the CAA have a growth duty policy, and the way it's worded on the website is the growth duty requires regulators to consider the economic consequences of their actions and to be proportionate in their decision making and to keep regulatory burdens to a minimum. The duty came into statutory effect from the 29th of March 2017, and the CAA report on the growth duty in the annual CAA report and accounts. Do you think with the changes that have been implemented within the last, say, 12, 20, 24 months, that's had an impact on the growth and the support the CAA have been able to give to industry?
I'd like to think so. I'd also like to think that the things that we've been talking about with you today in terms of the scalability, recruit more people, get better digital platforms, recognition of what the CAA board priorities are in terms of new user integrations. There's also another one from the CAA board, which is to do with service delivery. I think there are challenges in those regards from the RPAS sector, and I'm pleased that you found another part of the website that I can begin to perhaps quote in the relevant direction to try and make that point ever stronger to those that are making some of the tougher decisions further up the food chain, because as you probably come to expect, a lot of this comes down to the allocation of a finite amount of resource. And it's my job to help describe the consequences of any shortcomings in those kind of decisions for, like I said, throttling the ability of the RPAS sector as an industry within the UK. There is plenty of appetite from the government to lead from the front and for the UK to be a world leader. It's my job to perhaps begin to describe the detail of how you achieve that. And going back to one of my previous points, I think that ARPAS, 3 questions like that, can perhaps help me make that point to those that are making these decisions.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for letting me ask the final question, which actually is not a question. It's a formal acceptance of your invitation to cooperate that you specifically made on record with regards to PDRA. Because when I see the numbers that your team is 20-25 people, our regulation special interest group is larger than that. And we have just started that group. So clearly there would be a benefit in terms of sharing workload in a way and cooperating between the industry and the regulator. And I think that PDRA is on the top of our list because we consider it's a way to transform a project approach on OSCs into a product that we can scale up, and it becomes a few weeks application process, easy tick, 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 as opposed to several months of back and forth on our end and on your end. So clearly, yes, we welcome the opportunity to discuss on PDRAs. So thank you guys, I guess. Thank you guys for being here with us today at our annual conference. Any final words?
Yeah, no, I'd just like to say, can we have a round of applause for the CAA, please?